In May 1940, Britain was not losing a war. Britain was losing the idea that it could survive one. France was collapsing. The Low Countries were already gone. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the coast of northern France, pressed against the sea by an enemy that moved faster, coordinated better, and seemed to rewrite the rules of modern war overnight. In London, maps were updated daily, sometimes hourly, with red lines pushing westward. Each update felt less like information and more like a verdict. On the evening of May 10th, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. There were no cheering crowds, no sense of renewal. The appointment felt procedural, almost administrative, like assigning someone to oversee an inevitable decline. Churchill himself understood this. He later wrote that he felt as though he were walking with destiny, but destiny, at that moment, did not look heroic. It looked terminal. The government he inherited was fractured. Confidence in leadership had eroded during the so-called phony war. Neville Chamberlain was discredited but still influential. The war cabinet was divided not on tactics, but on survival itself. Some believed Britain should seek terms. Others believed resistance was possible, but could not explain how. Churchill's first challenge was not Germany. It was doubt. He had no illusion of immediate victory. The army was under-equipped. The Air Force was stretched. The Navy was strong, but strength at sea did not stop tanks on land. Britain's global empire looked impressive on maps, but maps did not fire rifles or stop bombers. Leadership, in this moment, was not about plans. It was about preventing collapse before plans could even matter. Churchill's first speeches reflected this reality. They were not optimistic. They were honest to the point of brutality. He spoke of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, not as rhetoric, but as a warning. This was not a promise of triumph. It was a contract. He offered no shortcuts, no secret weapons, no diplomatic miracles, only endurance. Behind the scenes, the situation worsened. By late May, evacuation from Dunkirk became the only option. Even that seemed unrealistic. The beaches were exposed. Air cover was thin. German artillery closed in. Some ministers quietly calculated how many men could be saved. Others calculated how many could be sacrificed to buy time. Churchill listened to all of it, then did something unexpected. He refused to frame the crisis as a choice between options. He framed it as a test of character. Britain would fight, not because it was guaranteed to win, but because not fighting would end the country as something worth preserving. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was a recognition that surrender, even negotiated, would not stop the war. It would only remove Britain from it. Leadership under collapse is not about certainty. It is about direction when certainty no longer exists. Churchill understood that morale was not sustained by comfort, but by meaning. If Britain was going to suffer, the suffering had to have purpose. That purpose became resistance itself. As the boats gathered at Dunkirk, from destroyers to fishing vessels, Britain held its breath. Churchill knew the evacuation was a gamble. He also knew that if it failed, his government would likely fall with it. But leadership, in moments like this, is inseparable from risk. To avoid risk was to accept irrelevance. What emerged from Dunkirk was not a victory. It was something more fragile and more important: belief. Belief that survival was possible. Belief that Germany was not invincible. Belief that leadership, even in retreat, could still shape the future. The war was far from decided, but collapse had been postponed. And in that pause, Britain found its footing. Winston Churchill did not govern from a position of strength. He governed while standing on ground that was actively eroding beneath his feet. After Dunkirk, Britain was alive, but stripped bare. Most of its heavy equipment lay abandoned on the beaches of France. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, ammunition. The army that returned home had men, but little else. On paper, Britain still had divisions. In reality, many were hollow formations, capable of marching but not fighting a modern mechanized war. Churchill knew this. The German High Command knew it too. In the summer of 1940, the threat of invasion was not propaganda. It was operational planning. Operation Sea Lion existed not as a bluff, but as a contingency awaiting air superiority. The English Channel, long Britain's moat, now looked narrow. Coastal defenses were improvised. Old weapons were pulled from storage. Home Guard units trained with broomsticks painted to resemble rifles. None of this inspired confidence, and Churchill made no attempt to pretend otherwise. Leadership, in this phase, became an exercise in balancing truth and survival. Privately, Churchill received intelligence reports that were grim. Luftwaffe's strength exceeded expectations. Fighter command losses were high. Radar stations were vulnerable. Pilots were exhausted. At the same time, political pressure mounted from unexpected directions. Within the War Cabinet, Lord Halifax continued to argue that Britain should explore peace terms through neutral intermediaries. His argument was not cowardly. It was pragmatic. Britain stood alone. The United States was not yet in the war. The Soviet Union was bound by a non-aggression pact with Germany. The empire could not compensate for isolation in Europe. Churchill did not dismiss these arguments lightly. He listened. He debated. He argued fiercely. But he refused to accept the core assumption behind them, that peace was still negotiable from a position of dignity. To Churchill, any peace offered under these conditions would not preserve Britain. It would dismantle it slowly, under terms dictated by a regime that had already shown contempt for treaties. The decision to fight on during the Battle of Britain was not driven by optimism. It was driven by timing. Churchill believed that survival itself could change the strategic equation. Time might bring American support. Time might fracture German priorities. Time might expose limits in an enemy that appeared unstoppable. Surrender would freeze history. Resistance would keep it moving. As the air war intensified, Churchill's role became more symbolic, but no less real. He visited bombed neighborhoods. He stood amid rubble. He spoke to civilians who had lost homes, families, entire streets. His presence mattered not because it solved anything, but because it acknowledged the cost openly. Leadership under collapse does not promise safety. It promises shared risk. The speeches from this period reflect that understanding. "We shall fight on the beaches" was not a call to arms in the traditional sense. It was a declaration of refusal. A statement that Britain would not define victory narrowly, nor accept defeat quietly. It reframed the war not as a contest of armies alone, but as a test of national endurance. Behind the rhetoric, the machinery of war struggled. Aircraft production was pushed to its limits. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, casualties mounted. Churchill was briefed daily on loss ratios, airfield damage, fuel stocks. He absorbed the numbers, then went out and spoke as if the future was still open. This was not deception. It was discipline. Panic would have been accurate, but accuracy was not the same as usefulness. By autumn 1940, invasion plans stalled. The Luftwaffe failed to destroy fighter command. Britain survived the air assault battered, but intact. The crisis did not end. It evolved. Collapse had been avoided again, not by brilliance, but by refusal to accept inevitability. Churchill understood something uncomfortable about leadership, that history often credits confidence when the real work is endurance. He did not win the Battle of Britain. The pilots did. The engineers did. The radar operators did. His role was to prevent the system from tearing itself apart under pressure. In a collapsing world, that was enough. Survival in 1940 did not deliver clarity. It delivered exhaustion. By early 1941, Britain was still standing, but standing alone had a cost that accumulated quietly. Cities were damaged. Industry was strained. Merchant shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced. The Atlantic, once a lifeline, was turning into a killing ground. German U-boats hunted methodically, not for glory, but for arithmetic. Every ship sunk meant fewer calories, fewer shells, fewer hours of fuel. This was not a battle Britain could inspire its way out of. Churchill understood this better than most. He had studied naval war for decades. He knew that blockades starved nations long before armies conquered them. The problem was that knowing the danger did not make it easier to stop. Britain lacked enough escorts. New technologies like sonar and improved depth charges were still unevenly deployed. Convoys worked, but not perfectly. Loss reports crossed Churchill's desk daily, each one a reminder that leadership could slow collapse, but not halt it entirely. At the same time, pressure mounted to show initiative, to strike back, to prove Britain was not merely surviving, but shaping events. This impulse led to some of Churchill's most controversial decisions: peripheral campaigns in the Mediterranean, operations in Greece and Crete, raids that promised political impact but delivered mixed military results. Greece, in particular, revealed the limits of willpower. British forces were sent to support a doomed defense against German invasion. The decision was driven by alliance politics and moral obligation as much as strategy. Churchill believed Britain could not afford to abandon partners publicly, even when the odds were poor. The result was evacuation under fire, heavy losses, and a strategic setback that critics seized upon. Crete followed. Airborne invasion shocked British commanders. Defensive preparations were inadequate. Intelligence was misread. The island fell after fierce fighting. Churchill took responsibility publicly, but privately. He wrestled with the reality that his instinct to act, to resist everywhere, sometimes produced failure instead of momentum. Leadership under collapse is not clean. It leaves fingerprints on mistakes. Inside government, criticism sharpened. Some accused Churchill of spreading resources too thin. Others believed he was chasing symbolic victories at the expense of core defense. He did not dismiss these concerns. He argued, sometimes angrily, that passivity carried its own risks. Britain could not win by hiding behind its island forever. If it appeared weak, potential allies would hesitate. If it appeared inactive, morale would rot. What Churchill was attempting, imperfectly, was balance. Enough action to signal relevance. Enough caution to avoid catastrophe. In a war fought across continents, this balance was nearly impossible to maintain. Meanwhile, the United States hovered just outside the conflict. Sympathy existed. Material support increased through Lend-Lease. But American entry was not guaranteed. Churchill wrote, spoke, and maneuvered constantly to keep Britain visible, defiant, and useful. His correspondence with President Roosevelt was persistent, sometimes almost desperate. He knew Britain's survival increasingly depended on forces beyond its control. This awareness shaped his leadership. He did not pretend Britain was self-sufficient. He framed the struggle as shared civilization, shared risk, shared future. This was not mere rhetoric. It was strategic necessity. Collapse, if it came, would not be sudden. It would be incremental, disguised as fatigue. By late 1941, Britain had endured more than a year of total war without decisive victory. The population was tired. The empire was stretched. The enemy remained dangerous. Churchill's approval rose and fell with events, but his position was never entirely secure. He governed by persuasion, pressure, and presence, not by universal confidence. Then, abruptly, the structure of the war changed. Pearl Harbor did not solve Britain's problems overnight. It did something more important. It made time meaningful again. The United States entered the war, and with it came industrial-scale Britain could never match alone. Churchill understood instantly what this meant. The war would still be brutal, but collapse was no longer inevitable. Leadership, at this moment, shifted again. From survival to coordination, from refusal to endurance shared. Churchill had held the line long enough for the world to catch up. The entry of the United States into the war did not elevate Britain, it redefined it. For the first time since May 1940, Britain was no longer the last barrier standing alone. That fact saved the country. It also quietly diminished its leverage. Churchill understood this immediately, even if he rarely admitted it publicly. Leadership under collapse had taught him how to hold a line. Leadership under coalition would test something harder: how to surrender control without surrendering purpose. American power arrived not as a supplement, but as a tide. Industrial output dwarfed British capacity. Shipyards, factories, airfields expanded at a scale Britain could not replicate. Strategy, inevitably, followed resources. Decisions that had once been British now required agreement. Plans that once revolved around survival now revolved around efficiency. Churchill admired American energy and feared American impatience. He worried that speed would replace judgment, that scale would flatten nuance. Most of all, he feared that Britain's experience, earned at terrible cost, would be discounted as caution or pessimism. These tensions surfaced quickly. The question of where to strike Germany first became a fault line. American commanders favored a direct assault on Western Europe. Churchill resisted. He remembered 1940 too clearly. He feared a premature landing would end in disaster. He argued for a Mediterranean strategy, attacking what he called the soft underbelly of the Axis. This was not merely strategic disagreement. It was existential memory clashing with fresh confidence. Churchill had lived through collapse. American planners had not. He pushed, delayed, maneuvered. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The resulting compromises shaped campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. These operations produced mixed outcomes. They tied down Axis forces. They gained experience. They also prolonged the war and fed accusations that Britain was avoiding the main fight. Churchill absorbed the criticism and continued to argue that a failed invasion would be worse than delay. Leadership, to him, was still about preventing catastrophe, even when allies were eager to accept risk. At home, the political atmosphere shifted again. Victory no longer felt impossible. Expectations rose. Tolerance for mistakes shrank. Churchill, once forgiven for grim news, was now judged by progress. Rationing continued. Bombing resumed in waves. The public endured, but patience thinned. Leadership under collapse had united people against extinction. Leadership under prolonged war exposed fatigue. Churchill's personal workload intensified. He traveled constantly. Conferences in Washington, Casablanca, Tehran. He spoke late into the night, argued into exhaustion, wrote memos by hand until dawn. He was no longer just leading Britain. He was selling Britain's relevance, over and over, to partners whose power eclipsed his own. The irony was sharp. The man who had embodied defiance now spent much of his time negotiating limits. He could not command. He could only persuade. Sometimes persuasion worked. Sometimes it did not. The Allied bombing campaign, for example, expanded beyond what Churchill privately found comfortable. Area bombing raised moral and strategic questions he struggled to reconcile. He supported it, then questioned it, then accepted it as a grim necessity shaped by forces larger than his own judgment. Leadership in this phase lost its clarity. There was no singular narrative of survival. There were only trade-offs. By 1944, preparations for the Normandy landings consumed the highest levels of Allied command. Churchill feared the operation, not because he opposed it, but because he understood exactly what failure would mean. He pressed relentlessly on details that frustrated his allies. Landing craft numbers, weather windows, artificial harbors, supply flows beyond the beaches. Dunkirk never left his mind. He knew how easily bold plans could collapse into desperate evacuations. He did not want success to depend on another miracle. When D-Day came, it succeeded. Later histories would frame this as inevitable. Churchill never did. He knew how close the operation had come to delay, cancellation, or disaster. Success did not erase his anxiety. It redirected it toward what followed as Allied forces moved inland. Britain's relative role shrank beside American capacity. Industrial output, manpower, and logistics now shaped the war's pace. Churchill remained visible and tireless. But the center of gravity had shifted. Leadership under collapse had given him moral authority. Leadership in victory demanded acceptance of reduced control. He adapted, but not without cost. Victory did not arrive with relief. It arrived with exposure. By 1945, Germany was collapsing in full view. Allied armies crossed the Rhine. Cities fell in sequence. The end was no longer theoretical. It was scheduled. This should have been Churchill's moment of vindication. He had refused surrender when collapse felt rational. He had endured isolation, doubt, and compromise. History appeared to confirm him. And yet, as the war in Europe ended, his authority thinned. The British public had endured 6 years of rationing, bombing, separation, and loss. They respected Churchill deeply. Many admired him. But admiration was not the same as trust for the future. Leadership under collapse had required defiance. Leadership after collapse required reconstruction. These were different skills, and the difference was felt. Churchill campaigned as a wartime leader in a peacetime election. He warned of danger. He spoke of vigilance. He framed the coming years as another struggle, this time ideological. The message was not wrong, but it was mistimed. Britain was exhausted. The population wanted security, housing, healthcare, stability, not speeches about looming threats. The Labour Party offered something simpler, not grandeur, but guarantees. Not rhetoric, but systems. The National Health Service, social safety nets, a restructured economy. They spoke to needs Churchill had deliberately set aside during the war, believing survival came first. When the election results came in, they shocked the world and embarrassed the mythology. Churchill lost decisively. The man who had symbolized national survival was voted out weeks after victory in Europe. This was not betrayal, it was transition. Leadership under collapse creates loyalty through shared danger. Once danger recedes, that bond weakens. People no longer want someone to stand between them and extinction. They want someone to organize normal life. Churchill understood this intellectually. Emotionally, it wounded him deeply. He left office not in disgrace, but in dislocation. His instincts were still shaped by crisis. His language still carried the weight of emergency. Britain was trying to exhale. He could not. And yet, history did not end his relevance there. As the Cold War emerged, Churchill returned to a role he understood instinctively, warning before collapse, not after it. His Iron Curtain speech in 1946 was not a call to arms, but a recognition of pattern. He had seen how democracies sleep through danger. He had lived what happens when they wake too late. When he returned to office in the 1950s, he was older, slower, more reflective. He no longer dominated events. He observed them. His leadership had shifted from command to memory, from decision to cautionary example. What remains, when stripped of legend, is not a flawless hero. It is a record of endurance. Churchill did not win the war alone. He did not always choose correctly. He made decisions that cost lives and time. But when systems faltered, when options narrowed, when collapse appeared reasonable, he refused to treat defeat as a normal outcome. Leadership under collapse is not about brilliance. It is about preserving form when everything else begins to bend. Churchill did that. Not cleanly, not without damage, but long enough. And sometimes that is the only victory that exists. It is easy to turn collapse into mythology. History prefers clean arcs. It favors figures who rise, struggle, and are rewarded with triumph and gratitude. Churchill's story resists that structure. The risk is not that he will fade from memory. The risk is that he will be simplified beyond recognition. Churchill did not embody confidence. He embodied resistance in the absence of it. That distinction matters. His leadership worked because the moment demanded refusal, not comfort. When institutions weakened, when allies disappeared, when rational calculations leaned toward accommodation, he chose defiance as policy. Not because it felt noble, but because it imposed clarity. That decision does not translate cleanly to every crisis. One of the most persistent mistakes in interpreting Churchill is treating his wartime posture as a universal model. It was not. It was conditional. He functioned best in collapse because collapse sharpens moral boundaries. When survival is at stake, hesitation becomes visible. Compromise feels like erosion. In such moments, clarity carries weight beyond efficiency. But when collapse recedes, clarity begins to splinter. The same rigidity that holds a society together under fire can divide it in peace. Churchill's post-war defeat was not evidence of ingratitude. It was evidence that leadership, if it does not change shape, is eventually rejected. What he understood, perhaps better than anyone, was that leadership is not about being right in general. It is about being right at a specific time, under specific conditions, with incomplete information and irreversible consequences. His greatness, if the word applies at all, lies in recognizing when the moment demanded endurance over elegance. Churchill's failures illuminate this truth as much as his successes. His misjudgments in peripheral campaigns, his blind spots about empire, his acceptance of brutal strategies when alternatives felt worse, all reflect a leader shaped by fear of collapse above all else. He was not immune to error. He was simply willing to carry the weight of it. In this sense, Churchill's leadership is not inspirational in the modern sense. It is uncomfortable. It demands moral stamina more than optimism. It asks whether a society can endure prolonged uncertainty without surrendering its core identity. That question has no permanent answer. It must be asked anew in each generation. Churchill never claimed to be a savior. He claimed to be a servant of a cause larger than himself, even when that service cost him power, rest, and eventually relevance. His most enduring contribution was not victory, but time. Time bought through refusal, time preserved through endurance, time handed over to others who would shape the peace he could not fully inhabit. Leadership under collapse is rarely graceful. It is loud, imperfect, exhausting. It leaves scars on institutions and people alike. But when it succeeds, it does something subtle and vital. It prevents the normalization of defeat. That is Churchill's real legacy. Not that Britain won because of him, but that Britain did not stop believing it could survive when belief itself seemed irrational. Collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as reason, as compromise, as fatigue dressed up as realism. Nations do not fall because they fail to see danger. They fall because danger becomes familiar enough to tolerate. This is the space Churchill occupied. He did not rescue Britain from destruction by force of arms or strategic genius alone. Britain survived because collapse never became acceptable language, never became policy, never became the quiet agreement that tomorrow did not matter as much as today's comfort. Churchill's leadership was not built on optimism. It was built on refusal. Refusal to pretend that surrender could be managed. Refusal to dress defeat as pragmatism. Refusal to confuse survival with dignity. In 1940, that refusal mattered more than tanks, planes, or allies that did not yet exist. But refusal has a shelf life. Once collapse passes, once survival becomes routine again, the traits that held the nation together begin to strain it. The same voice that steadied people under bombs sounded excessive in peace. The same warnings that once clarified danger now felt like shadows clinging to a past no one wanted to relive. Churchill lost power not because he failed Britain, but because Britain had changed its needs. That is not tragedy. That is sequence. If there is a lesson here, it is not that strong leaders save nations. It is that certain leaders are suited to certain moments and dangerous when misapplied. Churchill was not a universal answer. He was a response to collapse, and collapse, once survived, demands different hands. History often asks the wrong question. It asks whether Churchill was right. A better question is this: who was willing to stand between a nation and its own exhaustion when no outcome could be promised? Churchill stood there. Others might have too, but he did, and he stayed. That does not make him flawless. It makes him useful at the exact moment usefulness mattered most. Leadership under collapse is not about winning history's approval. It is about preventing history from ending prematurely. Churchill did that long enough. And then, when the work no longer required him, he stepped aside. Not gracefully, not easily, but inevitably. That is not failure. That is completion.